boy, here we go. Hello everybody, welcome to The Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it is time once again for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Yeah, I've been procrastinating on this one, meant to do this at least a month or so ago, and it's just been stacking up more and more. But now we got a whopping 25 projects to get through. 21 from this year and 4 additional ones not from this year as a bonus. Mostly yet another attempt to catch myself up on the various projects that passed me by over the first half of this excessively long year. Some from artists I know on a more personal level, some from artists I've been a fan of for a while but didn't have enough to say about, some I'd just been recommended from other people or other reviewers as something I should check out, and whatever else. Going through them gauntlet style yet again and seeing where I end up on them, talking about them as briefly as I see fit. May even end up with some keepers or year-end list contenders, who knows. There was actually a lot of good stuff this year. I've made attempts to keep these segments as brief as I can, but said attempts may have not turned out all that successful. I know even before recording, this is almost certainly going to stretch on for over an hour. May very well end up being the longest video I've uploaded to this channel so far. But as absurdly long as this video is gonna be, I've actually had fun with it. 2020's had a lot of good electronic music. There's so many segments this time around that I'm not gonna be able to fit all the favorites and least favorite tracks in the description. It'll actually exceed the character limit for description boxes. So I'll make a post in like Pastebin or something and link it down there instead. But yeah, may as well just get into it, starting out with an artist who I technically covered before, but only people who follow my Patreon page know about it. From Haunted Disco, Pale Souls Glow in the Dark. The artist in question paid me on Patreon to check out this album, so I wrote up a text post on it, which I'll link in the description. And while I did not really have enough to say to fill up a proper video, it actually turned out to be pretty dang good, so I'm giving it a quick shout out here. It's a pretty solid dark ambient sound collage project that aims to explore the depths of the artist's depression. Made of 2 10-minute tracks, the first of which is much sparser and darker and spookier, and the second of which is more melodic and comforting, and still the two coming together pretty cohesively. It's actually pretty dang good. Check it out. 7.7 out of 10. Next up, from Michael Menert, Fearless. Yep, Michael Menert's still doing good work as per usual. He also just put out an EP with his full Pretty Fantastic band called Permanent Vacation that I thought was pretty good and worth checking out if you want some laid-back summer jams. Though I decided to highlight this EP instead since I just liked it more and found it more interesting. Quick little 6-track experience that makes sure to deliver on all the gorgeous and lush orchestration and production I'd want out of a Michael Menert project. Maybe even some of the best production he's ever done. The bass on these tracks just absolutely crushes, especially on moments like the title track. He's delivering plenty of great sampled hooks, like on Too Blind featuring Daily Bread. I was too blind to see. Also really like the hooks on The Way It Used to Be and his quick rap verse on there. Not to mention the closer Afterglow is this absolutely gorgeous cascade of ambient synths that kind of reminds me of the final movement of LCD Soundsystem's 4533. And probably even better. Though Keep On Livin' and More Shine aren't as big standouts, the former has a nice change-up halfway through, but neither half of the track is all that memorable, and the latter did maybe drag a little bit. Still, even these lower points sound great. Overall, I don't know how much I'm gonna come back to this project from here, especially since it's so short and feels kinda inconsequential in the big scheme of things. Still feels like a side offering from him, and I'd be more looking forward to a full album. Something that has more meat on its bones than this, but I won't complain too much, since what we got was damn good anyways. Give it a shot. Feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Gabriel Lamar, Shared Fictions. Okay, I've covered this guy a few times before. I was pretty excited to hear a new Gabriel Lamar project, especially given his last one, Among Trees I Want to Live, was probably his best work to date. Or at least the one that best summed up his full appeal as an artist. Especially no easy task given how widely varied his previous decades-long back catalog has been, as I've detailed in the past. Obviously highlighted that album both as one of my favorites of 2018 and in my list of 40 more greatest electronic albums of all time. I admittedly wasn't expecting this to be on the same level, and it wasn't. But it was still a pretty solid collection of his usual organic textured dub techno grooves, with a surprising amount of focus on acid synths. Honestly, I barely have anything to say about this project from an individual track basis. They all kind of run together for me and feel fundamentally built on the same formulas. But the grooves are super smooth and well produced as always. I suppose a track like World Tree has a lot of cool guitar and harp and violin manipulations running through its more down-tempo focus, and the acid-driven grooves of Journey Within and Deep Focus were particular highlights. And the closer Collective Dream World Wonderland mix did bring in some uplifting and ethereal atmosphere in its mix, a notable step up from the similarly titled Stay in Wonderland, which I think kinda had the same beat and tempo. And that's about all I got. But the rest was still pretty enjoyable all around. It's really not a major standout in his catalog in the big scheme of things, just kinda sounds similar to most of his previous albums and doesn't do anything noticeably better than any previous projects of his. And I doubt I'm going to be coming back to this one for many more visits in the future, but it's enjoyable in all the same ways I would hope for a new project out of his, so I'll leave it at that. It was alright. I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Pablo Nouvelle, Obsolete. This is one of, I believe, 3 projects from earlier this year that I'd been directly recommended to by fellow reviewer Ryan Leith of Not Real Music. Go check that guy's channel out. He gave this guy a pretty glowing review, and I was curious about it. And while I personally do not think this project is great by any stretch or really knocked my socks off in any way, it was pretty neat. I haven't heard any of Pablo Nouvelle's other projects outside of this one 7-track half-hour mini album, but this is a pretty decent little deep house project. Very chill and muted, has some solid grooves. Texturally, it's pretty run-of-the-mill. Like, in the last Some Stuff I Missed, I covered a project called Binny Binny by Pamchi that sounded a lot like this, but that had a lot more texture and energy. This feels much more standard, more moody and downbeat despite everything being the same tempo. A lot of the synth choices, I suppose, kind of have a synthwavy feel to them. There are unfortunately moments here like the Carmen line and Fossil Fuel that just don't really add anything of interest and totally blend in the background. And given how there are only 7 tracks here, there's really no excuse for including bland filler like that. But aside from those two, the album's perfectly fine. The opener's got some cool watery atmosphere and sets the tone nicely with its deep grooves and interesting darker side tracks. Oh Would You Be There has a pretty memorable hook and manipulates its core sample in a cool way. Irritation has some neat little harp sounds and old-timey choir samples floating in between its plunky acid breakdowns. The closer, A Peek Inside, I think had some manipulated violins and pianos in the mix, finishes on an emotionally satisfying note. And if there's any keeper in this project's mix, it's the 3rd track, Saltburn. Has the liveliest percussion track, its chopped up vocal sample makes among the most effective hooks, and the toned down pianos throughout the mix give the whole thing a very classy and dignified finish to it. But again, this project has plenty of good tracks, no great ones. If you want some low-key deep house that delivers on some solid groove and atmosphere, Pablo Nouvelle is able to deliver that. When I first heard this, it was raining out, and that fit perfectly with the vibe this project created. But am I going to come back to this again or even remember it exists in a few months? No, probably not. Still, it's pretty decent. 6.7 out of 10. Next up, from Brian Eno and Roger Eno, Mixing Colors. So, Brian Eno is still doing his thing, this time doing a whole collab with his brother. I did see this project was 75 minutes long and 18 tracks and figured that there was going to be plenty for me to talk about here, but yeah, that didn't really happen. All these tracks are extremely sparse and minimal and sound pretty similar across the board. I don't know why I didn't expect that, because it's Eno. Thankfully, this project is still pretty enjoyable in spite of that. Sparse and minimal ambient music is Eno's bread and butter, after all. It's not much more than a collection of tracks played on keyboards, presumably all performed by Roger Eno. Usually either piano or Rhodes, or something in between. Basically all plinking electric piano sounds that vary slightly in texture, and it's up to the individual track's chord progressions and melodies whether any given track works. Some definitely work better than others, like sometimes the melodies get a little too sickly sweet for my liking, like a good chunk of Rose Quartz feels like it could soundtrack that part of a wedding where the bride walks up the aisle. And Blonde just came off weirdly cheesy or cliche in a similar way. Others, like Obsidian, just kinda weirdly rub me the wrong way and make me feel like I'm in church. and even further others just don't really give me anything particular of interest and blend in the background like Ultramarine or Iris. But some of these could be really comforting and satisfying like Spring Frost and Celeste, or hauntingly beautiful like Deep Saffron or Slow Movement Sand, or creating vaguely spooky atmosphere like on Burnt Umber, or even have more of an evolution like Snow and Cinnabar and Desert Sand. I like how the latter combines its comfy piano progressions with some wailing ambient pads. Also worth noting that I think Verdigris and Cerulean Blue are just alternate versions of Spring Frost, but with a different timbre of electric piano and played on a higher octave respectively. However, given that's one of the best tracks, I won't complain too much here. Obviously, it's not the most one-dimensional or musically barren project I've ever heard from Brian Eno, but it is still kinda overstuffed and inconsistent. I don't really consider this a top-tier work in the Eno pantheon. Still worth sitting through at least once and then picking and choosing favorite moments from there. The best moments still make it worth giving a shot, and there are plenty of them. Nice stuff. I'll give it a solid 7 out of 10. Next up, from Nathan Fake, Blizzards. I had been planning on doing a proper video on Nathan Fake since he's someone I'd known about for such a long time and hadn't properly sat with. When his Providence album first came out, I'd even planned on reviewing that, but I just never got around to it and let it pass me by. And same thing happened with this new album. But now that I have this format to go back to stuff that's not really relevant anymore, I figured I may as well stuff him in here. So given I'd wanted to check out this guy a little more in depth, I did what I did with Apparat and did a little quick marathon of his back catalog, so here's my very quick thoughts on those. Basically a mix of early M83 and older Schnauz, it's fine. Like the previous album but minimal tech house, like if you added some Jeff Mills and John Hopkins in the mix. Like the previous album but longer and more forgettable. Like a classic period Tangerine Dream album made out of sharper OPN style synth tones, I guess. Pretty cool but also kind of dragged in many spots. So I guess as it turns out I've not exactly been converted into a huge fan of this guy in general, but he does have a style he can call his own and none of those albums were bad. This latest album is his longest to date, just over an hour, which given I thought his last two albums kind of dragged on was a little worrying. But as it turns out, this is actually probably his best album to date. I mean, it's not particularly complex or deep, just mostly simple arrangements of warm, old-school analog synths, maybe calling back to sounds of the 70s, sort of, playing in lots of different arrangements that often have a bit of a bouncy, deep house feel to them. Again, sort of John Hopkins adjacent. Nothing on this project is particularly impressive from a sound design or attention to detail perspective. It's all pretty simplistic and stripped back, very little in the way of special effects or flash. The synths feel very untouched and humble and raw and down to earth, just synth music for the sake of synth music. And the synths all sound great! And the arrangements themselves, all these synth melodies can go from refreshing and uplifting as seen on earlier moments like Cry Me a Blizzard and Tbilisi, or downbeat and moody like North Brink to even a little creepy and intense like Vectra, or the beginning of Pentiamons. And the house beats underneath make for plenty of engaging grooves. And the longer tracks on here, like Stepping Stone and Firmament, actually turn out to be among the biggest standouts. Their sprawling lengths allow them a lot more space to evolve and change and go through multiple phases really seamlessly. Tracks that I wouldn't think would be that great at first would pick up and end up impressing me anyway, like at first I didn't think I'd be much into Ezekiel with its fairly muted opening stretches, but ended up going down a pretty dissonant and extremely reverb-heavy rabbit hole as it went along, and ended up impressing me a lot more than I would have expected. Similarly, the penultimate track, Eris and Dysnomia, had me thinking it was going to be a dud in its first 2 minutes with some super repetitive progressions that were a little too upfront and harsh for their own good. But the remaining 5 minutes turned out to well make up for that rough start, with lots of other beautiful synth lines that resembled harps and just the way it went along and turned that core groove into something surprisingly satisfying. Oh yeah, and the closer Vitesse is a nice cold and windy blast of ambience and a cathartic and fitting finish to this thing. I gotta say, I really freaking enjoyed this whole thing. I'll even hang on to it and we'll probably come back to it some more over the course of the year. It may not be anything mind-blowing or boundary-pushing, but it is a keeper for sure. It just had me like, freaking synths, man. Overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on this one. Next up, from Opus 84, Rotzeg. Alright, hope we know who Opus 84 is around here. I've covered her several times on this channel, been following her since the very beginning, and had her featured on one of my own albums. Since the last time I covered her on the first volume of Some Stuff I Missed, she has kept busy. She started up a whole acoustic side project called Sun Valley Vista that I haven't actually listened to anything from and probably won't, but yeah, that exists for anyone interested. But yeah, we got another mainline album from her earlier this year, and it's about as good as I would typically expect. Production-wise, it's probably her most impressive yet. A lot of these tracks, especially in the first half, have this kind of 80s punchiness to them that I hadn't really heard from her before, as seen on the first handful of tracks like Butterball and Guap, though still retaining that kind of abstract structure, or the strange hungover guitar and synthwave meander that is the title track. There's tracks like Objectively Fucking Awful, which does not live up to its title, that's great, and Block 1, Block 2 that have plenty of punch and weight, and while not really adhering to any defined structure. I like the broken up slamming beats of the former, and the latter's transition into something kind of progressive house-ish into a cool piano-driven track. Also, EMK2 is a nice, subtle, but uplifting moment that certainly stood out to me. Now, I will say that this project does lose some steam in its second half as it starts to rely more on the usual melodic ambient techno that is her hallmark, and doesn't pop out at me nearly as much, though they're still good in the same way that most Opus 84 tracks are, delivering some polished retro IDM atmosphere. There are some standouts in the back half like Groove EX, which starts out as this creepy, windy ambient piece, but builds up some melodic flares and an impressively glitchy and complex beat. Really like that one. Also, the project ends pretty satisfyingly with the last two tracks. Kogajiko has among the better melodies on this thing, and the shifting ambience of Sujiku makes for a pretty satisfying finish as well. Oh yeah, and there's some short interludes sprinkled throughout that are among the most intense and crazy moments on here, be it the burst of melody that is cheap electric polygamous grand piano 1, the abrasive and off-putting I Have a GeForce GTX 960M and One Day Left of High School and I'm Not Afraid to Cry. That's the title, alright. And in the back half, there's also Soylent, definitely the best of the interludes with its experimental breakbeat manipulations. That one was fun. I mean, overall, it's nothing super surprising or out of the box for Opus 84. Probably not her best or most memorable work ever, and a little front-loaded. But still plenty of cool stuff here to merit giving a shot. Nice stuff as usual. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Shypho, Ascension EP. Speaking of artists I'm friends with, I've covered Shypho before when he dropped his debut album, Proof of Concept, a pretty solid atmospheric progressive house type album that ended up getting enough replay value throughout the year for an honorable mention spot on my year-end list. He's now got another EP out, and it's also pretty solid. Again, it's nothing altogether surprising or out of the box for him, still pretty clearly adhering to his usual progressive house formulas with really solid production. I will say it takes a while to really get going. The opener, Odyssey 1, was a fairly standard ambient-centric intro. It was cool, but Parallel's Ascension mix was as plain and by-the-numbers a progressive house cut as you can get. Sounded great, but just compositionally felt very formulaic and predictable. But the EP does pick up immediately after that, still sticking to pretty standard ambient techno progressive house formulas, but the tracks afterwards had more texture and body. Also better melodies. The tracks Lunar Maria and Winter Sun are legit great. I love how they have a whole bunch of different melodic lines in different phases that come and go as you go on, and they all work really well. These tracks feel like they have more dimensionality and substance than most of Shypho's other work, which typically just sticks to one groove the whole time. These two feel like they're really taking you somewhere. And the last two tracks on here are solid too. Into Forever is pretty simplistic but has among the best melodies on this EP, and closer Kuwahara Rising is a nice triumphant ambient synth odyssey that, while kinda cliche, is definitely satisfying and hits the right emotional note I'd want. That one's really good too. So, yeah, I mean, this is a pretty good EP. Didn't offer much in the way of surprises. I kinda already knew exactly what I was getting here before I even hit the play button. But yeah, Shypho's still doing good work, making solid atmospheric progressive house as always, and yeah, this is definitely worth a shot. 7.5 out of 10. Next up from hyphyskazerbox, Skin Addict. This is one of two projects that I discovered through Rick the Lie's mid-year list. Check that guy's channel out, even if he doesn't upload a lot these days. I'd never heard of hyphyskazerbox before or listened to any of his previous stuff, and going by the album title and cover and many of the track titles, I don't think this is really something I would have ordinarily looked into. But the brief preview I heard in his video sounded kinda cool, figured it'd be an interesting change of pace, and I just jumped into it without any real expectations. And that album sure was something. Definitely one of the craziest and wildest projects I'm gonna cover here, mostly a collection of short tracks under 3 minutes. and often under 2 minutes. Made out of abrasive and intense synth melodies, some bright and flashy, some aggressive and raw, lots of chopped up samples, breakbeats, and whatever else, so long as it sounds crazy. It's completely nuts and balls to the wall from start to finish, hyper experimental and frantic and creative. Tons of really cool sounds flying past you at high speed. I thought it was pretty good, but did I love it? No. I mean, I have a ton of respect for its creativity. I thought the sound design was pretty incredible, but as may be predictable given my thoughts on similar projects that are this frantic and over the top, it did come off a bit much to me and would wear me down. This project's only like 45 minutes or something, but it felt a lot longer than that, just thanks to how absolutely unrelenting it was from start to finish. But still, it could have been a lot worse in that department as well. I didn't feel like this project was in dire need of cutting down. I never felt like I was bored either. Standouts include Mac and Cheese, which sounded like you chopped up a Vale Smith track and cranked the tempo way up. I'm Going Nuts helped me with its bombastic, flashy melodic grooves, got a bit of a nightcore vibe out of it, and somehow not in an annoying way. Brave Dave the Knave had a bit of funkiness to it, maybe. Clams had a jazzier flair with its screeching trumpet lead, among other things. I Got No Pressure When I Pee had some really cool acid breakdowns, but there were also moments like the Machine Gun Jackhammer one, which had that sample of some guy masturbating, and I was like, I don't want to hear that. I know, what did I expect on an album called Skin Addict, but still. That sample in the beginning of Communal Pornography was pretty funny, though. I mean, look, overall, I'm probably not ever gonna listen to this again. This is at best the kind of thing I would need to be in a very specific mood to enjoy, but I can definitely highly recommend it to people who are more into these kinds of styles. I imagine lots of people will properly love this thing. It's super creative, super interesting, super abrasive and unrelenting, and just all-around impressive. And yeah, take that all as you will, I guess. Definitely found a lot to enjoy here. Give it a shot. I think I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Mujuice, Rytm Moskva. Okay, another not real music recommendation. Mujuice is an artist from Russia. He's been around for a while, but this is the only project I've actually heard from him. This album is basically this very minimal tech house thing, 8 tracks that all stretch on for quite a long time, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, and each track containing a pretty steady progression and making sure to gradually switch up its sounds and building up and paying off at just the perfect pace. It's a very subtle listen, no texture or synth tone that by itself really pops out as incredible. Heck, a lot of these synths tend to be very flat and plain, perhaps distinct in its total lack of reverb. But it seems more like this project's main appeal is its construction and pacing, which is very well done. And the tech house grooves themselves, which, while nothing particularly mind-blowing or out of the box, are all super satisfying and driving. It is not a project that gives me much of anything to actually say about in terms of individual tracks. These blend together very well. They seem to operate almost more like a stream of consciousness, casually drifting from one idea to the next at the same pace, never straying too far from where we started, but containing just enough sonic variety to remain interesting all the way through. I suppose with tracks like Cassiope 2004, we get into some more chill sounds than we were before, and it leads right into the kalimba-covered Quart, which kind of reminds me of Bonobo Cirrus. Road Loop lives up to its title with all its layers of Rhodes electric pianos. Also quite liked the old-timey pianos on Grey Gardens, and that's about all I got. But lack of discussion material doesn't translate to lack of engagement. Even if I barely have anything to say on it, and don't feel like there's anything here I haven't heard before in some way, there's just something about this one that really kept me pulled in and invested that I can't really put my finger on. It's got its pacing down to an exact science. Just the grooves and overall construction is on a level as satisfying that none of these other projects are, while also accomplishing it with astonishing subtlety. This feels like it's got the potential to be like a wildcard year-end list pick. Just teetering on the edge of greatness, the kind of thing that's specifically designed to have a lot of replay value, but wouldn't pop out to you just by briefly previewing through it. I guess talk to me again at the end of the year, but for right now, this is a definite keeper, and I'll let this get away with a solid 8 out of 10. This was really nice. Next up from pilotredsun, Achievement. This project is from 2016, and it's here because it's gotten quite a few requests from people. Most notably, one particular guy in my comment sections has been asking me to check out this guy's music for ages. You know who you are. This is supposedly pilotredsun's only full album, and most of his work is like loose tracks uploaded to YouTube. Apparently not the kind of artist that plays well into my usual formats. But the guy who was requesting this apparently really loves him, saying he was on par with Boards of Canada and Aphex Twin, despite apparently also being the guy who came up with that Garfield meme that was a thing at one point. I presume hence the crappy MS Paint album cover here, which was not much of a confidence booster when I first saw it. I'm not gonna act like I was going wild with excitement to check this guy out, but I was morbidly curious anyway, couldn't hurt to give it a shot. And while shockingly no, I do not think this is one of my new favorite albums of all time, it was pretty good. Just kind of a low-key IDM release that's pretty chill and leans on some good melodies. The synths are pretty upfront, they have some groove and are cheerful, but not too cheerful. Honestly, I get why this connected with people so much pretty immediately. It's very much built on warm and fuzzy nostalgic synth textures, and its melodies and progressions toe that line between happiness and sadness. They have some nuance to them and are all well constructed. And I also saw an interesting comment on the Bandcamp page that described a project like this basically being the equivalent of Vaporwave, but for 2000s media. Rather than people getting nostalgic for the 80s and 90s aesthetics, it's instead a younger crowd pining for the days of the early internet and the height of Flash games. Remember freaking Flash games? Oh man, just seeing that comment made this project's vibe click all at once. It's very good music to wish Flash was still around too. Now, I know the comparison was drawn between this and Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada. The influence there is obvious just from a sonic perspective. But there are other artists that I think are a much closer match than even those. Ochre's A Midsummer Night's Dream is the most notable example. Very similar in approach and style and final execution. They're identical now that I think about it. As well as early period Metamatics. Like his peak Midnight Sun Pig Neo Ouija era. Very much has the same appeal for me as those projects. Now, I don't consider Achievement to be as strong as those particular albums, not just because of its derivativeness, which I can mostly forgive given the particular style is done well here, but this thing did very much run together for me, and I would have a hard time telling tracks apart from each other. This totally ended up as background music for me most listens. Good background music, but background music all the same. And of course, given I got into Metamatics back when I was 13 or 14 and hadn't yet had much experience in electronic music at the time, nothing's gonna be replacing that guy in my mind. But at the very least, I can see pilotredsun acting as the exact equivalent for the guy who requested this, as Metamatics is for me. I'm probably not going to hang on to this myself, given how I already have plenty of other projects that sound just like it, and have formed a much stronger personal connection over the years, but I definitely get the appeal of this and can give it my recommendation. The guy who recommended this to me is going to be hanging on to this album for life, I know that for sure. So yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Baauer, Planets Mad. Give it to them. This is not a project I would have expected to ever give a chance at all. Baauer is of course the artist best known for having made the Harlem Shake, and I kinda still really hate that track to this day, because my high school constantly made memes using that track promoting all its various clubs and after-school activities, and ran it so far into the ground even years after it wasn't relevant anymore, and as a result, for a long time, anything that even remotely resembled that track would be an automatic turnoff for me. I remember when Baauer released his first album, AA, and that got pretty decent reviews at the time, but my hatred for the Harlem Shake was still pretty fresh at the time, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But at least now in 2020, we're really far removed from the Harlem Shake's peak of relevance. I've been out of high school for a very long time, I have softened significantly on trap music and all its adjacent genres, and I've come to realize how unreasonable it was for me to resent that entire scene just because of one crappy track's overplay. And there was quite a bit of positive buzz surrounding this particular album, so I decided what the hell, I may as well give it a shot. Baauer may have an uphill fight for me to like this album, but it's not impossible. It's not like he has a high bar to pass over. And the good news right off the bat is that if this project is an attempt from Baauer to get some respectability and credit in his electronic music production skills back, he definitely succeeded on that front. This album is not a joke or a meme fest. Baauer is definitely taking this shit seriously and doing his best to deliver hard-hitting trap EDM bangers with an experimental flair, and not even sounding as dated as you'd expect either. It's perfectly listenable and well-produced while still keeping its edge. If you told me you thought this project was great, I feel like I'd get it. And I think Baauer has pulled off becoming an artist I can take seriously. No easy feat at all, I'll give him that. The bad news is that I still didn't think this album was anything all that incredible. Don't get me wrong, it's got its moments, mostly in the early parts of the project, but by the second half, it really slides off and loses my interest and just turns into bassy, banging background music. I really like the atmospheric trap banger of the opener, Plank, had plenty of detail and texture to keep me invested. I really like the chaotic and distorted explorations of the title track with its super crunching guitar lines, and the tribal focus of tracks like Magic, Yeehoo, and Pizza Walla were all pretty dang cool. Yeehoo especially, just really like its clattering of random noises and how it all comes together in some kind of African rhythm kind of thing. Pretty interesting, but the titular samples and Reach Up Don't Stop were kind of annoying and pulled down an otherwise pretty neat banger. Hot 44 had tricked me into thinking I was gonna get some badass breakbeat drum and bass type cut, but ended up disappointingly paying off in nothing but a simple big room kick for its drop. Ether was a screechy headache all around, and by the time we got to Home with Bipolar Sunshine, I was just officially checked out altogether. Not a fan of that guy's vocals here, and the poppy flair of it was all just a bit too sickly sweet for my liking. Also not really fitting well with the vibe of the rest of the project. And a lot of the other tracks I didn't already mention just kinda ended up weirdly boring and ephemeral. I don't know what to tell you. I can certainly respect this project for what it is. I enjoyed it a lot more than I would have expected to. And all the insane amounts of bass in the mixes of every track does just the right job to make even the least interesting tracks hear a satisfyingly earth-shaking groove at their core. But yeah, just kinda left me checked out and bored by the end. Pretty decent stuff, but yeah, not hanging on to it beyond this video. Overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Robyn A1200, Formula Maintained. Robyn's an old friend of mine from a different era in my life. I covered her debut album certainly in the first Some Stuff I Missed. That project was pretty solid all around, some nice retro synth stuff heavily inspired by Amiga game soundtracks. One of the best projects I covered in that particular video. Given this project's title, I was not expecting this to be that fundamentally different from what she had before, and it wasn't. Basically, kind of felt like a less interesting rehash of her debut, but I still thought it was pretty solid. Plenty of bangers to go around here, made out of synth tones pulled right out of old obscure video game consoles. Great bass lines, hard-hitting retro beats, funky melodies. The proper album, I think, is shorter this time. At least more of the track listing is remixes. I kind of just skimmed over the remixes. They did appear to differentiate more from the originals while still not feeling out of place in the track listing, so that at least addresses one of my criticisms with the debut. But as for the main tracks themselves, a lot of them kind of run together for me. Not to say there aren't still standouts. The opener Augmentation sorts us out on a really strong note and maybe even be the best track in the bunch. Trace has its lead melodies performed on a violin, why not? 1985 was a particularly hard-hitting, fast-paced banger. There were a couple of jazz-influenced cuts and fantastic way to jazz things up, and It's Not Jazz Vice dub, as you'd guess. Both turned out to be pretty solid highlights, and especially the latter. And Industrial Safari is one of the most texturally interesting moments that lives up to its title pretty well. And the other tracks, they're all good and delivered on the same kind of retro grooves just as well as everything else, just don't really stick out in my mind as much. But yeah, that's about all I got. Wasn't quite as into this as I was into her debut, just thought that had more variety and dimensionality, and this in comparison almost kind of felt like a B-sides comp or something. But at least personal enjoyment-wise, it's roughly on par with the material from the debut. Still worth giving a shot, nice stuff once again, overall feeling a solid 7 out of 10 on it. Next up, from No Mana, Secret Level. No Mana is one of those artists I've known about for years, but never actually bothered to sit down with a full project from him. I know he's a mainstay from the Mousetrap label, and I don't even remember when I first saw his name, maybe around that time that Above the Blue EP came out or something? I don't know. But yes, this is my first time hearing a full project of his. Before that, I basically just heard little iTunes previews at best, and that's about it. But I saw that he had a debut album out here from February, a nice meaty 11-track, 53-minute thing. And I thought, hey, may as well give this a shot, actually form an opinion on this guy, why not? And what I got with Secret Level was a very standard boilerplate collection of punchy modern progressive house, kinda Eric Prydz-ish, I guess. All the grooves are hard-hitting and fun in the way this genre always is, got some pretty solid melodic flares on many tracks too, no real clunker tracks to speak of. But on the other hand, it's not the kind of release that gives me much of anything to say about it, and I'm probably not going to remember any of this in the long term. Listening to this kind of reminded me of when I saw deadmau5 live, and one of his opening acts was this guy called Black Gummy. That guy just delivered the same blends of industrial techno for his whole hour-long set. Everything was good for what it was, and certainly worked well in that live setting, but offering absolutely nothing I hadn't heard before. Very much the kind of artist who makes more sense as an opening act for someone higher profile than someone who feels like a big headliner in his own right. And I get the exact same feeling from No Mana. I mean, not to say they sound the same. Black Gummy didn't have much of anything in the way of melodies from what I heard on his sets, much darker and more industrial stuff. And No Mana is able to deliver much more in the melodic department, as I said. This project even has a couple of pretty solid guest vocal features, and quite a few uncredited airy female vocalists, I'm guessing sampled. The opener and title track had some chiptune elements, care of guest producer Kipsel, that I thought were pretty cool as well. Maybe a hook or two got a little overly repetitive, like on Bottle Service, or you got a track like Special Move, which had a really nice expansive build-up, but kind of wasted it on a disappointing one-note drop. But that track wasn't too bad either. But yeah, for the most part, this is all kind of blended together for me. If this album were an opening live set for that deadmau5 concert I went to, I definitely would have enjoyed myself. This is very much the kind of stuff meant to be experienced in a live setting, and would have gone down great. But given how run-of-the-mill this project is by this genre standards, I don't really have any plans to hang on to this album beyond this video. Good for what it is, but nothing altogether incredible. Overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Daniel Avery, Drone Logic. I know Daniel Avery just came out with a new album this year called Love and Light, however it's been getting pretty mixed reviews and I decided not to bother. I remember when his Song for Alpha album came out, I previewed through that a little at the time and thought it sounded like really average artificial intelligence type stuff that I've heard a million times before. Ended up skipping out on a proper review altogether and getting similar vibes off the previews I heard of his new one too. But a lot of people had been praising his debut from 2013 here as something that was actually pretty good to even great. And I hadn't actually heard that one yet, so I decided to plop it in here, see how it turned out, and does it live up to the hype? Well, not totally sure if I could say it was great, but it was in fact pretty solid. I do have my issues with it, most notably I could not pick Daniel Avery's sound out from a crowd if you asked me to. He sticks very cleanly to well-established formulas of tech house and acid house and Detroit techno and all those. There's no sonic element he's bringing to the table that hasn't been done before many times over decades of dance music history, and especially not difficult to tell this guy loves him some Richie Houghton. Not really getting any points for originality on this one, but for the most part he does these formulas really well. These tracks all stretch on pretty long, have plenty of progression and evolution to back up their lengths, the acid synths sound great, the dance grooves are as satisfying as you'd want out of this kind of stuff. It's a lot of fun. The opening 3 tracks make for a really strong start to this thing, and based on their promise, could have been in the solid 8 range. You got some tracks with whispery female vocal snippets that add to the flavor. The pitch down voices on tracks like Water Jump and Neat Electric remind me of Plastic Man's Closer. He even breaks up some of the track listing with neat ambient side tracks like Platform Zero and Spring 27, very welcome for pacing's sake. And I like how he makes more of a turn into progressively more melodic and subtle territory in the second half with cuts like All I Need and Simulwreck, and climaxing quite nicely with the triumphant progressions of the last 2 tracks. New energy lived through it, and Knowing We'll Be Here, by the way, probably should have swapped spots. The former would have made for a more impactful and emotionally resonant closer in my opinion, even if I do quite like the friendly and almost poppy tone of the latter. It's like he slowly evolved from Richie Houghton to Disclosure over the album's running time. Now, there were more than a few moments on here where the acid-driven grooves started to run together and become too predictable and standard for their own good. There are tracks here like Naive Response, which just kind of feel redundant and rehash ideas done better elsewhere on the album. This thing runs on for just over an hour, and I wouldn't mind cutting a couple of these tracks out for the sake of tightening it up. But I certainly didn't come out of this project sick of the sound either. It's really just a stretch in the middle that kind of dragged a little. Overall, while not really a big creative breath of fresh air and containing its fair share of weak spots, I did all around quite enjoy this project. Definitely understood the hype. Not sure how much I'll come back to it or return to it in the future, but it's some really solid stuff. Definitely worth giving a shot. Overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Container, Scramblers. Okay, the other Rick the Lie recommendation. I'm told this artist is mainly known for making more minimal techno type stuff, and this is pretty different from the usual from him. I wouldn't know. This is the only one I've heard. This is more geared toward industrial noise type stuff, and it was nice and short, only 8 tracks. And I know I've not exactly been known as much of an industrial noise guy, but hey, it's something different to break up this video from all the various house records that take up the bulk of it, while still very much adhering to some techno formulas to ground it. You'll listen to a track like Nozzle and hear all these hyper-abrasive distorted acid synths squelching into oblivion over a banging 90s IDM beat. I thought this might not be as out of my usual element as it may seem. There are in fact moments that were a bit much for me. Wasn't huge on the opener with all its high-pitched squealing, but after that it got pretty fun, lots of balls-to-the-wall bangers. Now it is also the kind of project where you hear one track and you kind of got the gist of the whole thing. Maybe there's a moment like Ventilator where I thought it was going to be something different with its pure haze of distorted noise in the beginning, but it quickly switched over into being one of the hardest hitting bangers in the bunch. But I don't know, you wouldn't think a samey noise techno record would be much of my thing, but I had a lot of fun with it. I just kept it at low volume so as not to completely damage my hearing, and ended up with tons of great headbang-worthy material. Is this the kind of thing I see myself coming back to a lot in the future? Probably not, but I got a lot more personal enjoyment out of it than I expected to, so take that all as you will. This was pretty solid, 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Close to the Sun, Make You Smile. Close to the Sun, aka Jacob Martin, is an obscure Bandcamp artist who's also a semi-regular commenter on this channel who's stuck around since very early on in this channel's life. I first checked him out with his first album, Friends, around early 2016, since that was back when my audience was small enough that I could just randomly look up albums by regular commenters like him. And I had nothing to say about that project. It was kind of like a generic EDM new disco album with a fairly amateurish production, and the 9 tracks on it all kind of sounded the same, though I remember quite liking the track We Have Ignition. He then had a follow-up album in 2018 called Instant Memories, which was better, more interesting, gave me more to say, but ultimately I just reviewed it in the form of a YouTube comment on the intro song as I didn't enjoy it enough to make a video on it. I didn't want to feel like I was punching down. That album was still pretty decent overall, had nice variety and pacing, and the grooves were not bad, but still had quite a few generic sounding moments, and the mixing and mastering was still very below average. I hoped this third album would be an improvement on what he was doing before. He advertised it as being his most lyrical album to date, and the first to include his own singing, not just vocoder vocals as seen on previous albums, which didn't exactly get me excited to hear this, as I wasn't huge on the vocals on his last album, but I kind of just jumped in anyway. So what did we get with Make You Smile? Well, to start with, the production is definitely a step up this time around. He's still doing his best to make mainstream sounding radio pop EDM and new disco type stuff, plenty of Daft Punk worship and the like, and I do feel like the grooves come together more coherently this time than they did before. I'm not gonna say they're way more professional sounding, this is still clearly coming from a bedroom producer who's doing all the mixing and mastering work himself and hasn't fully gotten the hang of it yet, but he's getting there. This stuff is at least more satisfying to listen to. There are still a few moments like Midnight where the drums are mixed a bit too high, or Snap where the drums aren't mixed high enough, or maybe more like the mix is getting overstuffed to the point of swallowing up the drums, or Alky where the bass line feels slightly out of sync with the beat, but there are also moments like Ancient, which is this fairly straightforward trance thing, and it comes together really well. That was probably my favorite track here. Just in general, the production is a lot more polished and well balanced than it was before. I also do quite like the orchestral tinges on a track like Party Inside Your Head, or the squelching acid breakdowns of 983, even if the latter is almost a complete ripoff of Slow Acid by Calvin Harris. I still appreciated it being here and thought it was good for what it was. Instrumentally, this thing is fine. There's still room for improvement, sure, but he's come a pretty long way since 2016. The trouble, of course, comes when we get to the vocals, which, okay, I'll admit the singing wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. There is one track where he goes without any processing, I Want You to Love Me, and that one track did in fact confirm all my biggest fears going into this. Not only is he having a hard time staying on key, and his delivery puts too much emphasis on the consonants sometimes, but also, good God, does this guy need a better mic. His voice is totally muffled and it sounds awful. But most of the time he does filter his voice through some noisy freestyle vocoders or some auto-tune. There are tracks like Remember Good Times where the singing actually turned out surprisingly alright post-processing. The lyrics about needing to pay bills now kind of caught me off guard since I thought he was still a teenager, and the stuff about how it's okay that he's not going to be some big Billboard charting star producer kind of read to me as, who needs the Quickie Mart? Not me! But still, not bad. I wasn't really paying attention to lyrics for the most part, and those were the only parts that outright distracted me. The vocals are consistently the worst part of any given track, but the processing and vocoders save most of it from being outright awful, and most of it is chalked up to him using a crappy mic. The muffled quality of his voice recordings usually does not blend well with the more polished tone of the instrumentals. I mean, when I was making 04, I had an early demo with the track Autopilot where I used the default mic on my laptop to record my voice, but I thought it sounded like complete crap and didn't blend well, so I waited until I got that proper mic over there that actually captures my voice better to finalize the mixes, and that turned out a lot better. This guy definitely needs to do the same. It's a shame because most of these tracks are like one step away from being pretty solid electropop material and just don't quite get there, mostly thanks to those vocals. It's kind of a hard album to recommend because of them. They get in the way of just so many tracks here. Now, of course, as I told him before, I'll reiterate, producing a good electropop album is not easy, especially for someone with little to no budget. It's arguable whether or not I even pull it off myself, and this guy is mainly inspired by mainstream artists who have tons of money behind them and high-end studios to accomplish what they need to, and of course working with much more professional vocalists that are, paid to do what they do. I definitely have to commend Close to the Sun for his continued efforts to make this kind of music on no budget. He's certainly improving with each project and getting closer and closer to the sound he wants to make, but he's still not quite there yet. This project does unfortunately have its share of unintentionally cringy moments, but he's almost there. Get a good mic, perhaps put less focus on the vocals, put a little more finesse in the mastering, and the mastering is definitely better than last time, so keep it up. Given the vocal mixing is so consistently subpar, I can't bring myself to give this a full-on recommendation. Probably also liked his last one a little better as a result. But it is perfectly fine from a compositional level, perhaps a bit simplistic, but certainly not simplistic to the point of cynicism or laziness. I can tell he really cared about this stuff, so if all I've described sounds like the kind of thing you could stomach and wouldn't bother you, give it a shot, I guess. Personally, I'll let this get away with a solid 6 out of 10. It's alright. Next up, from Dan Deacon, Mystic Familiar. Dan Deacon is an artist who's been recommended to me a few times, likely because Fantano has covered him multiple times, and hey, he's considered electronic. He releases frequently on Domino Records, the label that helped launch John Hopkins and Fortet, and I'd heard buzz that this was supposedly his best album yet. I can't fully speak to that myself as I couldn't be bothered to listen to his other projects. I'd planned on doing another mini and brief segment, but this video got too overstuffed and I decided against it. I seem to recall briefly previewing through his last album, Glycerif, for a little when that came out, but I don't remember much about it besides the mixes being really dense and maybe classical inspired. I don't know. But I just jumped into this new one with no real expectations, and after listening to it, well, it's less electronic than I thought it was gonna be, more like some bombastic over-the-top indie pop rock with actual synths, almost more like window dressing. I guess it's somewhere between the soundscape-y synth pop of M83's Hurry Up We're Dreaming, more so the soundscape part, and the experimental modern classical electronic rock crossover of Anna Meredith's Fibs. But the modern classical elements are really more influenced by the likes of Steve Reich's music for 18 musicians. Lots of layers of repetitive punctuated sounds from various instruments, from synths to guitars to strings to lots of other stuff. I suppose that's how people were able to describe this project as minimalism, despite there being absolutely nothing minimal about it. Just loads of super propulsive, fast-moving indie pop with bombastic production that's going for super dense and highly layered mixes, but produced in such a way that all of these elements are given ample space to breathe. Somehow, I think the production levels of this thing are even more impressive than M83 or Anna Meredith. Like, maybe even significantly so, even though the actual tunes on those are better. The production is just absolutely freaking breathtaking across the board. I've got, like, no words for it. Feels like I'm just being dragged across massive Technicolor landscapes with the saturation turned all the way up. Just as well as Deacon is able to craft expansive, evolving psychedelic soundscapes on tracks like Weeping Birch or the closer Bumblebee Crown King. He can craft some poppy tracks that have a lot more groove and punch, like Sat by a Tree or Fell into the Ocean. Even has a few tracks that let the synths soar away like old musique concrète pieces. And of course, the 4-part suite ARP, which brings all of these sides of the album together at once. But as always, I do have my minor misgivings. The vocals weren't really my thing on basically any of the tracks here, even if they aren't the main focus and only occasionally come enough to the forefront to bother me. And there were a few tracks that didn't grab me as much as others, like My Friend, which did nothing that other tracks hadn't already. And weirdly wasn't that pulled in by the opener, Become a Mountain. Not really sure why. The project didn't really start wowing me until Sat by a Tree. Probably just the vocals again. There is something about this project that while I have almost nothing bad to say about it, this could possibly end up like that Anna Meredith project where I highly praise it in the moment but end up not coming back to it that much, but I guess we'll see in time. If nothing else, the production and sound design just so instantly floored me and pretty much convinced me that I had to rate this highly. Just so well balanced and managed to make such intense and densely layered compositions not weigh down on me at all, and make me feel like I could just as easily go through the whole thing again after it was done. So yeah, it's really good. Borderline great. I'll hang on to it and see if it sticks with me more. I'll let it just barely get away with a solid 8. Next up, we got Valance Drakes with An Angel in Alliance with Falsehood. I don't even remember where I got this recommendation. I think maybe one guy in my comments brought it up and I just threw it in here for the hell of it. Also, could have sworn this project came out this year, but it's actually from late 2019, so... oh well, I already put it here, may as well give it a shot anyway. I've not heard any of this guy's other projects, just kind of jumped into this one just to see how it went, and... yeah, this turned out pretty good. Not much to say about it, but I quite enjoyed it. This thing is a mix of super light but expansive ambience, and abstract but hard-hitting IDM percussion. The atmosphere is really enveloped and immersive and chilling, makes use of field recordings as well for extra texture, and the percussion has all the weight of something you'd hear out of, say, Burial, albeit with much more abstract rhythms that don't really even try to form a groove. Closest we come to a proper groove is probably the track Weak Humans, Wise Demons. But yeah, the production is excellent across the board. Now, it is also the kind of project where you've heard one track and you've heard them all. Very much follows the same sonic formula for every track, even when there's guest features from Richard Devine and Surachai. But the sound never gets stale either, so I guess take that all as you will. May not offer much of anything in the way of discussion material, but if you enjoy some well-textured but still sparse and atmospheric IDM, give it a shot. It's quite nice. 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Savant, Void. Yep, against all better judgment, I've decided to talk about Savant again. Not the first time I've covered this guy. I reviewed his Jester album a few years ago and did the full and brief segment, and boy was he the single artist to which that segment was the most detrimental. Do not, under any circumstance, marathon this guy's entire back catalog chronologically. Most of his albums are pretty much identical in approach, and many run on for well over an hour and a half, if not even bordering even 2 hours. You will completely wear yourself out, and I had to learn that the hard way. But to be clear, as formulaic as his albums can be, I think people got the wrong idea from my video and thought that I just flat out didn't like his stuff at all. Which is not remotely the case. I think he's perfectly fine. Pretty consistently talented, modern dubstep, electro house, complextro artist, who can actually be pretty versatile and even kind of justify the ridiculous lengths of some of his albums. All of them will at least have a bunch of solid keeper tracks. He can definitely be predictable and the kind of artist I gotta be in the right mood to fully get into. Not someone I personally put on regularly, but I definitely get why he's so well loved. Would also be nice if some of his fanbase didn't take him so goddamn seriously or berate people for listening to it wrong. Like, fuck off. But never mind that, this is not a review of the fanbase. Going into this project, I at least knew exactly what I was getting into now. Had a feeling I knew what it was gonna sound like, and yeah, it may be 20 tracks just under 100 minutes, because of freaking course it is. But he's pulled off albums of that length before that still kept me interested. And he wouldn't be totally worn down by a marathon of his overlong back catalog this time, which is only to his benefit. So I sat down with Void, expecting an overstuffed mix bag with a few really solid standouts, hoping for the best. And as it turns out, Void was an overstuffed mix bag with a few really solid standouts. But who would have guessed? The album is definitely never boring, even in its full 100-minute glory, but as with pretty much all his other albums, you basically gotta pick and choose favorite individual tracks. He's never gonna do any editing of his own. And of course you're gonna run into some duds. For instance, I did not at all care for Howie Rock, Leviathan, or I Don't Give a Fuck. The latter was just an annoying headache all the way through and little more than an excuse to yell fuck over and over. Yeah, that one was flat out terrible. I'm Hot interrupted an already subpar electro house groove for a computerized voice to announce Big Dick Energy. I suppose that did in fact make me laugh, but more out of embarrassment than anything. There were tracks where certain parts would work, but not really the whole thing, like the lush orchestras going up against excessively grating playground melodies on Cheesy, or All I Want, which could have been this interesting jazzy downtempo thing, but all the random vocal interjections really got on my nerves, or Bad Man, which was fine, but basically an all-around worse version of Patricia Texan's Bauhaus. And there are just some forgettable tracks that are okay while they're on, but not keepers. See Weeper, Overseer, or Sunny California. I suppose the latter's at least catchy, but also pretty repetitive in one note. But for every dud or mediocre track, there was a solid standout. There were a whole bunch of really solid Zircon Getaway-esque electro-funk type tracks, like Oasis and Monolith and Tickle. Great grooves there all around. You had Xeon, which kind of had this orchestral tinged video game soundtrack element to that electro-funk mix that also made it a particular standout. And Monster, in spite of its much sharper and more shrill synth tones and not being as well produced as those other examples, still had a good enough groove to stand out and remain solidly enjoyable. Burnout was a total banger with lots of propulsive energy. There's two tracks that have some nice flute accompaniment, and Zealot and Soulgate, the former really starting this album off on a strong note. There's even not one, but two ambient tracks on here, Mystique and the title track. The latter is the better of the two, even builds up into a nice subtle synthwavey beat in its second half, sounds great and is a really satisfying finish to the project, and the former would have been nicer if it didn't have those yelpy pitched up vocals in two little quick moments, but still a pleasant surprise to have here and lots of expansive cinematic atmosphere created with that one. Definitely good stuff. So yeah, I guess I all around did enjoy myself listening to this thing. Exactly half the tracks here I can mark as standouts. I guess at this point, you basically gotta know what you're getting with Savant, and this didn't do anything that I wouldn't have already expected. It exemplifies all his usual strengths and weaknesses. If you're already a fan, you'll get what you want. If you never liked him in the first place, this isn't gonna change your mind. If you've never tried a Savant album before, I guess this is as decent a place to start as any. It's not way better or worse than average for him, at least. Personally, I thought this was pretty good. Certainly not hanging on to the entire thing, but if I just cut the project in half and only keep the 9-10 tracks I really liked, I'd end up with a really good to even great electro-funk type project that might even end up bringing me back some more later in the year, who knows. But without any cutting down, Void is a massive overlong mess that contains just barely enough good material throughout to save it from mediocrity. In other words, it's a Savant album, take it or leave it. I'll let it get away with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up, from Lorenzo Senni, Scacco Matto. Okay, Lorenzo Senni is an Italian experimental artist who's been around for a minute, but is a fairly recent addition to the roster of Warp Records. And you know, Warp may not always promote great artists, but they're always going to be interesting. One of those labels I'll always look forward to hearing from. This project is Senni's first with Warp, though he's had a few before this that I didn't bother listening to. He's advertised as having some bold new blend of rave voyeurism that's even on the parental advisory sticker. Okay. This album's entirely instrumental, there's no parental advisory here. But it'd been getting quite a bit of positive buzz from a bunch of my viewers, so I gave Scacco Matto a shot. And yeah, this project is made entirely out of minimal synth passages and sequences. However, the synths themselves are very harsh and sharp and abrasive, very much have that Garden of Delete-ish quality to them. They play fast-paced, plunking, danceable rhythms that almost have a clubbery vibe, despite not a single drum texture to be found anywhere on the album. Sometimes these tracks will get a bit more ambient-ish, and sometimes they deliver some really balls-to-the-wall intensity. Certainly gets points for uniqueness. I can't really say I've heard any other projects quite like it. Just kind of a shame I was mostly left cold by it. Yeah, I wish I could say I found this project to be as exciting as people have said it is, but I kind of found myself a little checked out while listening to this one. A lot of these passages ended up kind of meandery and dragged on for me. Punchy and striking for sure, but whatever initial luster these synth textures had in its opening moments just kind of lost me and grew stale pretty quick. And I'm not really sure why. Maybe the lack of drums had something to do with it, but I'm not sure. It's not like these tracks couldn't still form a solid pulse. In tracks like Think Big, I'm able to better pinpoint strengths and weaknesses. That particular track has some excellent melodic progressions, but its high-pitched lead melody is way too shrill and ear-splitting and totally throws off the track for me. And even more strange, probably my favorite moment in the bunch was the most low-key, repetitive, and one-note cut of them all, Dance Tonight, Revolution Tomorrow. Just got some more emotional resonance in its comparatively more toned-down textures, I suppose? I don't know. There were other tracks I liked outside of that. I quite liked the hard-hitting percussiveness of the synths on the opener, Discipline of Enthusiasm. Canone Infinito had a lot of really beautiful melodic progressions, and The Power of Failing still used its nervous, screechy energy to its advantage and brought a semi-compelling groove together. But yeah, outside of that, something just felt missing out of this one. I wasn't annoyed by the shrillness of the synths, just kinda came out bored more than anything. Even the best moments here I thought were just pretty cool, I guess. You wouldn't think such a striking sounding and uniquely approached project like this would leave me this unengaged, but yeah, I don't know what to tell you. Probably still worth checking out. A lot of people have praised it highly, and I feel like I can get why. There's a good chance it'll resonate with you more than it did for me, but personally I can't really get enthusiastic about this one. Points for originality, but I just thought it was alright. Like a 6.3 out of 10. Next up, from Nicolas Jaar, Cenizas. Alright, Nicolas Jaar. I feel like this guy probably does not need an introduction at this point. I think most people know him for his work as Against All Logic and just generally being a token electronic music pick for music writers who aren't otherwise a fan of electronic music. I've never been a huge fan myself, hence why he's been relegated to this video. I do remember quite enjoying Space's Only Noise, but I haven't listened to it once since reviewing that first AAL comp. And the rest of his stuff, while also perfectly fine, came off to me as kinda derivative. Not to mention, all his solo albums felt like they were made by completely different people. Still, decided to give his new project here a shot anyways. Heard it was gonna be some dark ambient type material, didn't really know what to expect, just jumped in. And right off the bat, this was better and notably less derivative than I thought it was gonna be. Wasn't expecting him to sing on this thing. Well, more like tonally mumble. But still, he put his own voice in here. Actually, he did that in Sirens too, didn't he? Well, I guess it's not off-brand. This thing is a lot more acoustic-leaning than I thought, focusing on live instrumentation, like guitar and bass and piano and strings and other stuff like that. There's some sparse percussion and some synth work in there as well, very moody and dark all the way through, as you might expect. I quite liked the vocal harmonies on tracks like Vanish and Hello Chain. The latter has some very haunting choir-like passages that are quite nice. Agosto had a bass clarinet on it or something, and just really liked how that particular texture stuck out. Garden was a nice minimal piano piece that could have been pulled out of Drux. The last two tracks have a bit more depth, as Xerox tries to be a big dramatic climax, and Faith Made of Silk has an actual drum groove going on underneath it, trying to be more like an actual song rather than a sparse vignette, even if tonally it feels kinda out of place. And probably the big highlight all around was the 7-minute psychedelic death march of Mud. Quite enjoyed all the textures that went into that, and the sense of impending menace the whole thing creates. However, there were also moments like Rubble, which had this high-pitched squeaking, maybe saxophone that got pretty grating. The track Goche sounds like he's wiping his ass on a piano, or has like a virtual keyboard and is just swiping his mouse cursor around it at random. And I also did not care for his whispery spoken word on the track Sunder. And there's also forgettable moments like the neat but unremarkable musique concrète excursions of Menacid, or the singular minimal violin pad that is Vassiar, or the doomy mumbling on the title track. All cool while they're on, but I forgot they existed pretty quickly after they were done. I mean, I did generally enjoy myself while listening to this project. It is nice for what it is and probably has more good than bad. The mood is very well executed. I also like how Jaar is doing his best to form more of his own identity under his own name and is coming off less derivative and more like the creative mind that other people have made him out to be. But is any of this project so incredible that it's really going to stick with me long term? Not really. It's mostly a pretty ephemeral experience. That haunted disco project I mentioned at the very beginning of this video has a better chance of sticking with me than this does. I get why people liked it, and I liked it too, but I also kind of thought it was kind of a mixed bag, and I don't really see myself coming back to it. It was fine, like a 6.7 out of 10. But hey, if I wasn't huge on this Nicolas Jaar project, how about another Nicolas Jaar project? Also from Nicolas Jaar is Telas. I was marginally more interested in this second project from him, even if I heard it was basically the same kind of stuff. The fact that everything was outlined in 4 big long-form pieces all well over 10 minutes just sounded like a more interesting idea to me. And yeah, even if sonically this is pretty similar to Cenizas, albeit less acoustic leaning without as much focus on his own voice and just all around more harsh and abrasive in tone, I think I would say I enjoyed this one more. I think these weird electroacoustic meanderings play out more effectively in these longer and more evolving pieces. They feel like they have more dimensionality in this context. Not to say I don't still have my issues. There are still lots of textures here that can get kind of grating, like those squeaky horns, or more of his own whispering on a few moments in the first half of the project, or just lots of ear-splitting high-pitched synth screeches all over the place. Still don't like that. Also, a few of these tracks often feel like they're just made out of a bunch of different ideas strung together ad nauseum without transitioning as cleanly as they could. The track Tele Encima especially has this problem. Feels like it's hard cutting between different segments which don't feel like they justify all being the same track. That track also too often broke up what could have been some really compelling dreamy atmosphere with way too much grating synth distortions and screeches that just don't gel well together or sound good. But sometimes these segments do transition really well out of each other and feel like they're naturally evolving from more acoustic pieces to synth excursions, what have you. The opening and closing tracks, Tela Ora and Tela Yas, had more of a coherent stream of consciousness vibe to them. The former kind of gave me like Pink Floyd Ummagumma vibes in parts that I quite enjoyed. And the latter was probably the single most sonically welcoming and coherently structured piece of the 4. The only one that felt like it was originally conceived as one track. Also got a little Fear and Handful of Dust vibes out of some parts, that was nice. I think that last one was my personal favorite of these excursions. Also quite liked Tela Umo, which, while still very disjointed and containing its screechy parts, at one point felt like it was gradually building an actual groove out of its chilly Berlin school-style ambience, and had lots of really striking and evocative side tracks after that, like one maybe oboe and synth arpeggio solo near the end. That was pretty awesome. That track was pretty solid too. I admittedly don't see myself coming back to this one much either. There's a bit too many moments that didn't work for me, and textures that just felt like nails on a chalkboard. Cenizas was generally a more approachable and easier listen for me, but I did come out of this one feeling more fulfilled and engaged. It's pretty good. Still think that Against All Logic project he put out earlier this year trumps both of these, but whatever. This is a solid 7 out of 10. Next up, from Shye, Obscura. Okay, this one's piqued my interest for a while. This project comes out of Speak and Spell Records, same label that has Vale Smith on it. A bunch of fellow reviewers have covered this, and it's been getting some positive buzz, so I thought I should give it a shot too. I believe this is the, third Not Real Music recommendation. I have seen her previous releases pop up on various year-end lists, most notably the Wool Gatherer's Pond project, that this is apparently a sequel to. I figured I should at least have the decency to listen to that one first before I jump into this, and yeah, that project was pretty nice. Very low-key and nostalgic, but still nicely detailed and well-paced ambient project. Very warm, very pretty stuff. Didn't knock my socks off exactly, but it was nice. Obscura, meanwhile, is supposed to be the darker companion to that project. If that one was about places that hold childhood memories, this one is apparently about growing up and returning to the same places as an adult, perhaps realizing that they won't be the same anymore. Both tracks are only 5 minutes each, closer to EPs than albums, I think, though the tracks themselves do stretch on a bit, 5, 6, 7 minutes. So, Obscura itself, it's not really that fundamentally different from Wool Gatherer's Pond, but it is in fact notably better. Sadder, more nostalgic, feels more emotionally nuanced, and better produced as well. Although not as texturally varied, a lot of these tracks are kind of made up of a lot of the same instrumental elements. Electric piano keyboards, various bells and chimes, some low-key synths a la Boards of Canada, regular pianos too. It's all very plinky and low-key, but still very smooth and blending well together. Kind of feeling like, say, a Rum Pistol project, but without any of the IDM elements or any percussion. Probably did a better job of bringing its mood together than anything he's ever put out. There are a few tracks that take a while to get going. 112 Moons didn't really grab me until those little plinky pianos came in like 2 minutes in or so. Firefly also had a bit of a long intro that dragged on, but once it really got going, it became an easy favorite as like the warmest and happiest track in the bunch. And the field recording of the train passing at the end of The Carillon was weirdly compressed and low quality, didn't blend as well with the mix as it probably should have. But the lonely piano meanderings that take up the bulk of that track well make up for it. And the first two tracks and their moody electric piano and bell ramblings don't really give me much of anything to complain about. I guess the opener's a little short, but still has quite a few nice rhythms behind it. I mean, on the whole, Obscura may not be a particularly impressive piece of work, but it does have a fairly unique approach that sets itself apart despite being made up of lots of tones and sounds I've heard plenty of times before, and it does pack quite a lot of emotional weight in its scant running time. Not sure how much I'll be coming back to it in the coming months, but I would definitely say it's worth giving a shot. Just an all-around very nice ambient project. I think I'll even hang on to it. 7.7 out of 10. And finally, from Frequent, Dream Recall. Alright, finishing this video with one last project that is not from 2020, but rather 2017. I kinda needed to talk about this one at some point. I've referenced Frequent many times as a co-founder of the Upscale label and being associated with tons of super talented names like Hudson Lee, and False Noise, and Elon Moore, and Vorso, and so many others. Some more directly than others. I've rated all of these names super positively, and given how he is so often lumped in the same category and held up on the same level, I was excited to get into him when I did first check this album out several months ago. Admittedly, though, I wasn't as crazy about Dream Recall as I thought I was going to be. Well, I still think it's a great album, but I do definitely have my issues with it and don't have as much to say about it as I do about other projects from his label mates and contemporaries on the scene, which is why it's here and not in a proper video of its own, despite being one of the longer segments here. Now, it should be no surprise to note that the production and sound design is absolutely top-notch across the board. Super detailed, super modern and polished, super atmospheric, super hard-hitting. Every second of the album has plenty of crazy details for you to pay attention to, always really striking and exciting. It's something that every track on here has to lean on. I already went into this project expecting it to be great in that department, knowing his contributions to Hudson Lee's Headspace's album, and he did not disappoint. But there was also a part of me that felt like having come into this one late led to me not feeling its impact as much as I probably would have if I picked it up when it came out. It doesn't feel as strikingly original as some other names in this camp, and that's not just including the ideas that have been directly improved upon by later projects, like how the track Broken had a similar chill groove to those Hudson Lee would deliver much more consistently better on Headspaces. Chopped up vocal hook on that one isn't amazing either. But a few of these tracks, especially closer to the back half, are just really balls-to-the-wall modern dubstep excursions with a tonal metallic wubbing that pretty directly brings Noisea's Outer Edges and Comatusser's Hollow Worlds to mind, to see the tracks D-E-I-L-D and Memory Den with Clock Vice in particular. Not necessarily a complaint, at least it's not strictly adhering to trends in the same way AU5 did with Divinorum, but it is similarly a little derivative in that way. And there are moments here where he combines the more all-out experimental modern dubstep drum and bass stuff with some more melancholy atmospheric tones, and those were pretty consistently big highlights. See the opener Alpha State, or Lucid with Jan Amit, or Moth Chamber. Also do quite like those ethereal guitars are worked into the glitchy mitches on Sleep Spindles with Sumac. And my freaking god, the title track is an absolute trip, combining whole side tracks with violins and pianos and tons of other sounds coming and going at high speed and never sticking to any structure. The kind of thing that Elon Moore would really become known for, but yeah, Frequent is on that same level. The closer is absolutely incredible and the easy standout on the project. But while we're on the topic of Elon Moore, this project does have more similarities with an album like Long Awaited Journey, because like that one, Dream Recall is a concept album. And the particular execution of said concept is where most of my issues lie. Now, on paper, this idea sounds freaking awesome, making the entire album about dreams and exploring your inner consciousness on a fairly literal level. That's certainly an ambitious idea that sticks out from the crowd. But the way he goes about connecting the music to this overarching concept I felt wasn't as imaginative as it could have been. First of all, there's the spoken word narration segments delivered by some uncredited young woman speaking in a kind of monotone voice and appearing on 3 different tracks. Spoken word stuff is one of those things where you really gotta be careful when you're using it. If you don't execute it just right, it'll come off corny and distracting. Eidolon Moore's voice may have taken some getting used to because of his thick accent, but I think he had the right idea by making the story very vague and symbolism heavy. The kind of thing that would require you to do more thinking for yourself and come up with your own interpretation for what it all means. Dream Recall does not have the same kind of room for interpretation. The monologues in this project can get pretty on the nose and feel like they're just directly explaining the concept to you. Now, sometimes it does work, especially on Alpha State where the narrator's presented kind of like this omniscient force, and it's pretty neat. But for every more articulate line that uses some more interesting vocabulary and does evoke some imagery, there's another line that's just very basic and flat, and again, just on the nose, like, "You are awake," or "Empty, it is only you." And they get progressively worse with each appearance, the worst passage being in the title track where the narrator says, "Good morning, you've made it. The end." Sometimes feels like I'm listening to a low-rent sci-fi audiobook for 13-year-olds. Put a little more imagination into it. But the narration, that's whatever, I can forgive that. It's not really that annoying or intrusive, and has its cooler moments. And the sound effects on a few tracks like Descent are fine too, and in the case of that particular track are pretty effective at atmosphere building, even if it kind of reminded me of the opener to Secede's Trishasla. What really bugged me though is that there's also a main guy character this whole story is supposedly coming from the perspective of, and there's many points at which you can hear this guy's breathing. That was one step too far for me. And sometimes you can even hear his pitched down voice saying two actual lines. On DEILD, he says, "Fuck." And in Memory Den, he says, "What is this?" Absolute poetry really adds a lot to this story. But whatever, at the end of the day, most of these problems have to do with what is basically short segments in between tracks and not something that directly impacts the music much. The concept is pretty shallow and feels like missed potential, yeah, but given how much more effort clearly went into the sound design and production, I can forgive the subpar storytelling. The good in this album well outweighs the bad. So, take that all as you will. I think it's been topped. It's not the most incredible thing that could directly come out of this scene, but that's not saying much. I also have very high expectations when it comes to any artists in his particular circle. Frequent is just as mega-talented as all those people he's associated with. I think he's just got a bigger and better masterpiece in him than this. Still, pretty damn solid stuff. You like the rest of the upscale type stuff, you'll like this too. I'll let this get away with a solid 8 out of 10. But that's it. That's the end of the video. That's all 25 segments. Alright, but of course this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.